introducing Richard Coe, Managing Director, Wing X Advance, who will join us on stage to introduce the first panel. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Hello, I'm just making sure this works, so I haven't got mic'd up beforehand. Hello, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the Royal Aeronautical Society for organising tonight's discussions. And this evening, the discussions are entitled Rethinking Business Aviation, Time to Rethink Business Aviation. So I think this is a legitimate question to ask of our industry, given the context of what some are calling a lost decade in terms of a very, very slow recovery, if any at all, since 2009 for the global business aviation industry. But on the other hand, some may argue that over 20 years, this industry has been transformed and is still so young that it's very difficult to know what are growing pains and what indeed are structural flaws. So we're going to start in this panel by trying to put our finger on the key challenges in the industry and to work out how those challenges have come about and what their impact is, before the second panel addresses some solutions to those problems. We've got a fantastic panel here this evening to help us explore these challenges, and I'm going to briefly introduce them, although you'll find out more about them as they speak. So we have Charlotte Peterson, who is CEO of Lux Aviation Helicopters, and I'm sure you all know about the Lux Aviation Group and its global empire of business aviation activities. And Charlotte has a fantastic track record as all sorts of things, including helicopter pilot and working in search and rescue, also working at the CAA level in Luxembourg. And it'd be a pleasure to hear about her very much sort of operational insights into what the key challenges are in our industry. Now, Steve Varsano is Managing Director and founder of the jet business. And Steve has been in the industry for really quite a long time, and I understand from his bio that he's been involved in nearly $5 billion worth of transactions. So you know, Steve is a very well-known speaker and expert in our industry. His showroom, which I understand is still the first in the world, right, for business jets, is just around the corner if you feel like picking up a jet tomorrow. And it's a pleasure to have Steve here this evening. And Dave Edwards is also really an industry veteran. He's director of Synergy Aviation.
I'm getting worried about what they're going to say when they get to me.
Dave has been with a number of large companies in our business. He's now with Synergy Aviation. He's been with Qatar Airways business jet organization, and he's been with Gamma Aviation. Brian Humphreys, as I'm sure you all know very well, is president of the EBAA. He's held, I think, all the big titles that could exist at the EBAA. He's been chairman, he's been CEO, he's run Shell Aircraft, so he knows a lot about the operational side, as well as the regulatory environment. So we're going to start to make it somewhat simpler. We're going to start with three challenges. And I'm going to open up to some others as well. But the three challenge themes that we're going to start with are regulation, access to airports, and bringing in new users to the business. And I'm going to ask each of my panel first to tell us which of those themes they think present the biggest challenge to our industry, and why, and what the impact is. And just before we begin, I would say the second panel is going to explore the solutions, but please forgive us if once or twice we stray into solutions. We will try and stay with the problems only and leave the rest to Ava. Okay. So Charlotte, if I could start with you,
yes.
and ask you that question.
Regulations-wise, I believe that the European regulations at least have been prepared for and to airliners. In many ways, the regulations are set so it fits the airline industry, where you have many aircraft of one type, which means that training is cheaper. You operate between large airports with plenty of runway space, and you have a uniform fleet. Most of them, they also have one company operating in one country in Europe. There are only a few airline groups now. They are, however, experiencing the same issues between moving between countries in Europe as the business jet operators are. So there are many things in regulations that make it difficult for the business aviation industry, not just business jets, but also the helicopters, as the regulations are kind of prepared to fit the airliners.
Why do we have this problem?
Well, there are many issues in it. If you look at the training, there's one training program that fits for all. However, it fits the airliners better than any other of the industries, simply due to the cost. Take a type rating for a business jet, it can be up to 8 times more expensive than a type rating for an airliner type of aircraft. So it's very expensive to fly the same amount of hours in simulators, etc., as is required by the airliners.
And how much does it hold us back? I mean, just looking at it from Lux Aviation's point of view, you know, how much bigger, you know, how much easier would it be for you to grow your business if you didn't have this inhibitor of constantly trying to fit within regulations which, as you say, were designed primarily for airlines?
That would relieve us a lot, I would say. We operate right now in Europe 9 AOCs in 9 different countries. They are all regulated under EASA regulations. However, every country, unfortunately, understands the same regulations with small differences, meaning it's almost impossible to standardize manuals between countries. But that, I have to say, it's not just for business aviation, it's also for the airliner groups. Thomas Cook, TUI Group, they have the same issue. It's very, very difficult to have the same set of manuals, the same standards from across countries. However, another problem is the bilateral agreements. If we want to move an aircraft between 2 countries, you need to have bilateral agreements in place. Those are not something that's easily achieved. It can take up to 1 year to be able to move an aircraft from one EASA country to another one. It's not easy.
Thanks, Charlotte. Steve, you know, you see, presumably, you know, when you're talking to prospective owners, the regulatory issues, the complexity of all the regulatory issues, you know, definitely come onto the radar. But would you pick that out, you know, in comparison to the other 2 big themes we're talking about, you know, accessing airports, the operational side of it, but also, you know, the difficulty of accessing newcomers to the business? You know, which of those strike you as the most important impediment?
I feel like a politician. I can give you the problems, don't have to give you the answers. I think the biggest problem is avionics regulations. I think it has a domino effect across so many sectors of the industry. You know, the manufacturers now are having problems finding buyers for new airplanes, but people don't want to buy new airplanes because they depreciate so quickly, because they keep coming out with newer technology, and the airplanes that are, you know, 5, 6 years old are now half the price of a new airplane. So they keep on adding new regulations to make these airplanes change, and they're very expensive to upgrade the airplanes. So people don't have an idea of a budget that they can plan on going forward. And the other side of the aircraft ownership is there's no shelf life, basically. So these airplanes could fly forever. And you know, they get expensive to maintain. And obviously, when these regulations get so burdensome, you can't afford to actually keep an airplane. So the industry tries to find ways to increase population of owners and users of airplanes. But the problem is these owners get disenchanted with being in the field because there's so many unknowns that the government keeps on imposing on the owners.
And these burdens, are they getting worse and worse, or is it something that do you think is just the kind of product of a certain phase?
I mean, it's a necessary evil, I think. I mean, you want to make the system more efficient. You want to make it more safe. You want to make it, the airways closer together so you can get more airplanes to fly. Obviously, what we saw in the Middle East, a few weeks ago with the Airbus and the Challenger being too close together, it's sort of those increased regulations don't always work. But yeah, it does have an impact on people buying airplanes, and a lot more will now stop and just charter, which is okay. It keeps people in the charter industry. And but ownership, there's too many unknowns, and people don't want to go into the unknown with that size of the capital expenditure. Do
you actually see potential owners pulling out of deals because, frankly, it's too much hassle on the
airplanes that are only 10 years old? You have to add 20% of the value of the airplane, upgrade the cockpit. The guy in the back seat sees no different at all. He doesn't feel anything. So he's the person who's writing the check, or he or she. And they start saying, you know what, it's not worth it. I figured out how much it's costing me to fly this airplane now. It's cheaper to just charter.
Dave, moving on to the veteran. Regulation.
I'm really worried what he's going to say when he gets to me.
The regulatory burden, do you see it from your experience as burdensome but necessary evil, or something which is genuinely inhibiting the industry?
To be honest, to talk about regulation at the moment, where in 2 years' time we have no idea what, as a UK operator, our regulation will be, is perhaps we should focus on the other two things, really. But it's a necessarily evil. I think it's the same deal. We're working within an airline environment pretty much, and it comes down to who your inspector is and their approach to the regulations. And as ever with authorities, numbers are an issue. There aren't enough inspectors out there for everyone. We see the kind of contact time we have with the regulator is becoming less because the kind of burden's being put back on us more as operators. So it's a strange kind of scenario to end up in. But as I say, the problem is in 2 years' time, I don't know what regulations we're going to be working to.
Right, and that's another factor, so. Yeah, which we'll revisit. But going back to the kind of the one-size-fits-all problem in being regulated as an airliner, why do you think that's come about? What's caused that problem? Why is this industry, which in many ways over the long period has flourished and created great economic value, why is it still stuck within the one shoe?
I guess it doesn't create enough economic value as the airlines do. I mean, the airlines fund an awful lot of the infrastructure that we all have, so we're naturally a smaller voice in a bigger church kind of thing. And that's the challenge we're always going to face. I think we've moved a long way. It's not quite as bad as it used to be. We're certainly getting a lot more fluidity, if that's the best word of the evening, with how the regulators work with us. And I think the regulation is much more interpretable to your organisation. So it's a lot more positive than it used to be. But as I say, 2 years' time, who knows?
Brian, is it much less of a problem than it used to be? I mean, you've been at the forefront of the regulatory treatment of this industry for a couple of decades. So, do you see things improving?
Well, let me say a few points. I mean, I think in the old days of ARIs, it was appalling. And we put a Gulfstream on the British register. It costs $1 million to put it on the register, and it costs us $1 million to sell it. And it spent its entire time flying in the US. So, I mean, that was ridiculous. But I think we've made a little bit of progress on the I'm not supposed to talk about solutions, but I'm just going to very quickly say I think we are making a bit of progress on the regulational side. FTL for business aircraft, it's in the pipeline. and runway performance to bring us level with our US colleagues, so we could use up to 80% of the runway subject to risk assessment. That's been through NPA. I'm sure a lot of you commented, and that's going into rulemaking, and we're quite excited about that. But I just want to go back a bit. I mean, I think if I'd been on this stage last year, I'd have been saying I was pretty depressed. I feel this year a lot more optimistic. I mean, first of all, we in EBA have celebrated 40 years. Our colleagues in NBA have just celebrated 70 years. The first Q1 has seen the best growth we've seen since 2011. And I sometimes think we always beat ourselves up. Let's look back a bit. So in the last 20 years, we've gone from 2,000 aircraft to 4,000 aircraft in Europe. We've gone from about 400,000 departures up to 700,000 departures, back to about 650,000 departures. We in EBA have gone from 88 members to 688 members. So it's not all bad. And actually, if you look at this on a graph, most businesses would be quite happy to have that. Sure, it's been tough in the last recent years, but I think certainly this Q1 has cheered us up. Let's see what happens next month. But compared with 1% growth that we had in last year, we had 9% growth in March in departures and 6% in the first quarter. So I think things are looking a little bit brighter there. I want to talk about access, because I think access is certainly one of the challenges. I think, you know, regulation, we're making progress. I think we're encouraged by what we've done. Access is the big problem. We were very active in the slot regulation back in 2009, 2010. This damn thing has sat in the Council since 2011 because of Gibraltar, and it's gone nowhere. So we in business aviation don't have any grandfather rights. Now, when I first became involved in business aviation in 1989, the Shell fleet was based at Heathrow, and we had 24, not us Shell, but there were 24,000 business aircraft movements a year at Heathrow. Today, we're lucky with 500 or 600. What's worrying is we've got about 25% of the traffic at Luton, but if we don't have grandfather rights, what's going to happen? So there are some airports in Europe, Geneva, we get 4 slots an hour, Dusseldorf, we get 2 slots an hour. But it has been very frustrating that we haven't been able to take forward slot regulation, which recognises the grandfather rights of business aviation at these mixed mode airports. The one area where I think there's an opportunity for hope is access to smaller airports. Some of you may know, and I'm sorry this is a solution, but I have to mention it. We've been working with LPV approaches. With the GNSS agency, that's the people who put the satellite up. It is disgraceful. We've all paid for EGNOS and the satellites. We could have Cap 1 at any airfield in Europe now, and we haven't got it. We've got 300 airports. Our colleagues in the US have got 3,000 airports. We've got to shift this bureaucracy. And I want to come back to Steve's point. You know, often our aircraft are equipped. Some 30% of our fleet is equipped to do LPV approaches. But the ground stations aren't cleared. So we've got to free up that one. So often we do modifications on the aircraft, and then the ground support systems aren't there to support us. And we're very worried that data link and things are going to go the same way. We bust a gut, we bend over backwards, we get these things modified, and then we can't use them.
So what's the problem? Why is that the case?
Because we are always the willing horse. We go on, we do the modifications, we're told to, there's a deadline, we try and meet the deadline, then the deadline slips because the ground activities aren't ready. But I think, I mean, I'm sure Mark will have something to say about this, but I think the LPV approaches, we've got a real opportunity here. It is disgraceful that at some airfields, we've got an ILS at one end, we don't have an ILS at the other. People are doing circling approaches in bad weather. They're landing with 9 knots tailwind. We could have a Cap 1 approach at the other just for clearing it. So I think somehow or other, we've got, across Europe, and it's certainly not just UK, across Europe, we've got to get more of these LPV approaches in. Because, you know, there isn't really a shortage of airport capacity in Europe. There's a shortage of airports we can get into in all weathers. And I think that is where we've got the great opportunity.
Charlotte, can we talk about that a little bit, about airport access? I mean, Lux Aviation obviously flies into hundreds and hundreds of airports. How important is the limitation that Brian's describing of not being able to get into many of the airports that you probably wish to fly in as a first option?
Well, first of all, I would say all our aircraft are equipped to fly as Brian describes, and also all our helicopters. They are, however, able to do it to any spot outside the airport. However, we cannot do that now for the moment, and we are limited with the small airports as well, just as Brian described. So yes, it is an issue, and of course we would wish that it was different.
Can we talk about London, just as we're here? I mean, what about the London capacity? Is that a particular problem for Lux Aviation?
Yes, yes, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Because, you know, for the industry as a whole, and I'm quoting a well-known author from the audience in his excellent recent paper on London airports. Thank you, Robert. And I want to talk about, you know, the London area, just because, you know, we've got this issue with slot-controlled airports basically limiting business aviation. Do you see this as a problem that's getting bigger and bigger? You know, that you know, you've got the big airports basically blocking business aviation to a larger extent, and investing in new airports is extremely expensive, and then there aren't enough of them.
Yeah, I fully agree. It is an issue, but now, since I represent not just the fixed-wing area but also the helicopters, I'll just mention the helicopter part here actually, because I just attended a very interesting event that was planned by the Luxembourg government, our headquarters are in Luxembourg, where they talked about future city planning and what will happen to all the major cities in the world, where it's evident that people are moving towards the cities, and it's getting more and more, and all the capitals, all the larger cities will have more and more traffic in the future, and it's simply just growing. Helicopters are, of course, in my opinion, a great solution for the ones who need to go fast from one end of the city to the other. However, for helicopters, the huge limitations in the cities is that there are absolutely too few heliports. So take London City, there's basically just one place in the inner London area where helicopters can land. If it's IFR, however, and the cloudy weather, you can't land there, right? So it's really an issue. In New York, they solved it by floating helipads or floating heliports, which is an option. Other cities have solved it by simply building heliports, also on top of buildings, etc., etc. But this is something that could generate a lot of business to develop this area, and also free up a lot of time for all the people who are stuck for hours in traffic.
Dave, may I ask you about that as well? I mean, you've got a multi-regional experience in seeing the limitations of infrastructure. How important a problem is it?
It's a shame, really, that a general election got called, because I've done my research on statistics to give to politicians. 125 airports in the UK, 25 served by airlines. And then we get into the problems with 2005, and this is almost something out of Yes Prime Minister, 2005 PPG3, which was the policy on airfield, on planning for the UK, comes in, and an administrative error manages to delete the words hospital and airfield out of the concept of planning, so that airfields and hospitals are now designated as brownfield sites, which means very sort of back home with the UK stuff here. That means that airports and hospitals are technically available to be built on without too much involvement from councils. Chancellor announced, I think, 2 years ago that any brownfield site in the UK is essentially now planning free, so you can just build on anything you like. So if you have a hospital, you can sell it and turn it into a housing estate, or, which is the problem we're now facing, you can turn airfields into housing estates. And airfields have traditionally kind of made money from landing fees and the property on the site. If you don't have both together, you won't really make an airfield work. The problem we're now facing is that all of a sudden they can be turned into housing estates. If I owned an airfield, I know what I'd do. I love aeroplanes, I love aviation, but I'd much prefer to build 1,200 houses and retire to Jamaica as a result of that. this has gone on and on and on. The General Aviation Awareness Council in the UK has been trying to get this changed. It's just one administrative error is losing us infrastructure. If you look at Surrey at the moment, vested interest in Fair Oaks, declare that one straight away. The problem is, you've got Redhill, which is going to become now a housing estate. You've got Wisley, which closed down, albeit, well, Wisley probably went 20 years ago, but that's going to become a housing estate. Fair Oaks is now going to become potentially a garden village. And as I say, vested interest in that not happening, but if it happens, because it's being allowed to happen by the government. Comes back to a huge issue on transport infrastructure, joined up thinking in the UK, which doesn't exist at all. And that's the problem for me, is that aviation is not being treated in the right way. Nobody sees us in what we really bring into the economy. And I'll do this at every conference I talk at. The amount of money we generate as a byproduct of what we do is, you know, huge in comparison to what the actual aircraft deliver. And I think it's time for government, and you know, I'm sure they've got other things to talk about at the moment, well above airports and business aviation access. But it's a big thing for me, that we're just ignoring this thing. We'll have loads of housing estates, it'd be great. We'll all have nice houses, but we won't have anywhere to operate the aircraft from. And you know, Heathrow doesn't want us in the nicest possible way. And I can see that happening at the rest of the London airports. I mean, I'm not sure if it's common knowledge, but I hear an FBO is going to start up at Cranfield next. So we're moving further and further away from London to serve London airports. Manston's gone, and that was London Manston.
London Manston, yeah.
So.
We've covered a lot of ground on regulation and policy, and meanwhile, some excellent questions have come up on the screen, and I've missed many of them, but I'm going to grab one of them right now, because I think it's a good one for Steve. And it is the aircraft ownership model constraining the development of business aviation?
Well, there's a lot of, obviously, with the apps that are coming out today, it's becoming very cheap to fly on unknown legs. So, you know, they're cheap if you want to go from A to B tomorrow, but, you know, I don't know how you get back to A unless you rent a plane. So there's a lot of this technology that's making it cheap, but those people who are actually taking advantage of that technological advances aren't really owners of airplanes, or they're not really going to be owners of airplanes. I think that you know, the technology is advancing so much that again, it's going into the cost of building airplanes. But I think if you really want to leapfrog it, you see more and more. It happened again this morning. Another flying car version that comes up, and you know, as much as old as most of us in this room are, you know, the reality of a Jetsons environment is getting closer and closer. And you know, you have flying cars, you have you know, pilotless single passenger drones, you have, you know, a lot of these concepts that are actually coming to fruition now. And you know, you're talking about the life of helicopters, you know, might have an issue for their long life, because some of these short distance capabilities are going to get sacrificed by some of these new technological advances. It's going to be much cheaper to get in. People are going to have to get comfortable with that, you know, the safety level and things like that. But it's something that I think, you know, nobody really wants to see that elephant slowly walking into the back door of the room. And I don't know how much it's going to advance into longer range, bigger cabin airplanes. But you know, the step has already been taken for these kind of, you know, pilotless drone passenger carrying capability. So I think that's going to actually bring more people at a low level of cost entry into the aviation field.
Okay, but right now, and really for the last few years, the aircraft ownership model, if we call it that, has been in trouble, right? I mean, it's you know, in a mid and small size sector, we've seen a slump, or at least pretty stagnant market for almost 10 years. And that was traditionally where, you know, a lot of the buyers who would, you know, eventually come to your showroom, I guess, would, you know, this is how they would come up through the industry. So, you know, what is the problem there, and why is it been there for so long? I
mean, it's funny because if you take the smallest jet and if you want to call it the ultra long range jet, your fixed cost to operate a small Citation or a Gulfstream, you know, are so close. I mean, you're talking between $600,000 and $800,000. That's your fixed cost, whether it's a Citation or a Gulfstream. And, so it's your operating costs that vary very widely. So the price of fuel obviously is one, but the technology again goes back to that. I don't think the model is hurt, and I think and as we were talking about how many more airplanes are in the system, if you go back from the drastic crisis in 2008, you're talking about 40 to 45% more jets in the fleet in the world today than there was in 2008. So, the model is not broken, and more people are getting into the airplane market. So, I think, we hear the OEMs complaining they can't sell airplanes, and that's what all the investment banks like talking about. But from the pre-owned side, there's 4 or 5 times more pre-owned airplanes selling every single month than new airplanes. So you got, really 3,000 airplanes trading a year in the pre-owned side. The model's not broken.
But we're still talking about a relatively tiny number of people. I mean, you spoke about the cost right there, and I think we're kind of generally moving on to the kind of well-known perception problem in the industry. Do you think that there is an issue here that simply owning a jet, if that's what our industry stands for, owning an aircraft, we are talking about such a minute part of the population that it's incredibly difficult to promote this as a big important industry?
Yeah, of course it's small in talking absolute numbers, but it's been getting bigger and bigger, enough to feed all our families for many years. But if you no matter what you think about his social positions, Trump actually you get a guy running a government that operates corporate jets. And all of a sudden, it's okay to own a jet. And the corporations don't have to feel like they're going to get slammed just for operating a jet. This has been the biggest problem since the banks, the manufacturers, auto manufacturers went to Congress. It destroyed the business. Instead of standing up when they said, how did you get here? Did you come on a private jet? Instead of saying, yes, we're trying to save an industry. We have 1 million employees. How did you get home last week, by the way, Congressman? Nobody stands up and says, this is an industry. This does bring money into the economy. This does give jobs and all that kind of stuff. We're so meek in protecting our industry. We're trying to hide under a rock instead of coming out boxing.
I mean, Brian, I know you want to add to this. I mean, we've heard those messages, on a top line level. This is an important industry. This is creating, tens, hundreds of millions even. But what are you? Because I'm thinking, I know the EBA is doing so much here. How do you change that? And I don't want to move too far into solutions. But why is the problem with us for so long when we've been giving these messages out for years?
Well, I think again we tend to beat ourselves up a bit. Some of you may know in 2015 we did a perception study, and we interviewed EU policymakers, users, companies, and so on. And we were actually pleasantly surprised with the result. 90% of people saw business aviation as a necessary and useful business tool, which was fantastic. 70% had an excellent or good impression of business aviation. And the really good news, and this is coming back to Richard's point, they had a better perception now than they did 5 years ago. So we're an industry that the more people know about us, the more they like us. However, there are some significant challenges. One is environment. Now, we're 7% of the traffic, but we're 1% of emissions. And yet you only have to pick up any local national rag to see somebody's used a business jet and they've destroyed the environment. So we've got to do more on that. Costs and perception, it is seen as elitist. But one of the exciting things for me are the developments in the last couple of years. Single-engine turbine IFR, lowering the threshold, and with the rules and regulations of EASA that EASA are imposing, actually an acceptable level of safety. Then we've got, and I'm not advertising, but then we've got Wheels Up coming in, Surf Air coming up. We're going to see more and more options at the lower level. So I think freedom to choose is a really important thing, and it's what we're going to offer. But above all, and this is where it's not a solution because we're not there yet, but we're going to need all your help. We really do have to change the perception of business aviation, and we're going to mount a big campaign to try and do this. Get the facts across. Now, we know it's important. 400,000 jobs. We just did a study with Booz Allen Hamilton. 400,000 jobs across Europe. Farnborough's a really good example, and I know Biggin Hill is the same, but I'll quote the Farnborough figures. 12,000 jobs if you add the whole thing up across the region. One of the biggest employers in North Hampshire. So I see reports in the local paper about these people in business jets. They don't add anything. They're just destroying the environment. Hold on. We're one of the biggest employers in the area. So we've got to get this message across, and that's what we want to do. Now, we've produced a communications kit. Any of you can have it, which has got a few fundamentals in it to help us get that message across. And then over the next 5 years, you're going to be hearing a lot more along the No Plane, No Game campaign, but tailored to Europe, probably face-to-face, more personalised issues. So because if we don't change that perception, then we're never going to be strong in the arguments for access to airports and everything else. So I think it's the key challenge for me over the next 5 years. We've been talking about it a long time. We've been giving the numbers aren't enough. We've got to show it in human terms and make people realise that this sector matters to the country, matters to the local community, matters for jobs.
Charlotte, the perception problem, we all understand that there is some sort of problem out there. How have you seen it over the last 5 years, particularly since being part of Lux Aviation? Is it a problem that holds back your business and the growth of it?
Yes, I think definitely there's a perception problem as well. Is if you open a normal newspaper, if there's an article about business aviation or jets or helicopters, it's because there's been a scandal or a crash, an accident. And that's what's interesting to have in the news, and of course that somehow gives people a view that this is either a business that is only for the wealthy, so kind of a snobbish feeling, or it's a business where there's a high risk to join. And for example, with the risk, when we started up in Lux Aviation our helicopter parts and decided to prepare a specific organization for the helicopters, I had to look into figures, and I looked after helicopter statistics in safety, and something caught my eye, because safety statistics, you normally measure it with accidents per flight hours. That is something that works very well for the airliners who fly many hours and have few accidents. If it would have been casualties per flight hour, airliners would have looked less good. So helicopters, they somehow adopted this, and they measure accidents per, not flight hours, because you don't have the data for helicopters. Nobody knows how many flight hours helicopters fly. So what would have looked good for helicopters was accidents per safe landings. However, that is not measured either, at least not in a unified data box. So they had to move down the line. So accident statistics for helicopters is accidents per type of helicopter, meaning that you're now down to maybe one accident for 300 aircraft or 300 helicopters, which make it look really, really bad. Although commercial air transport with helicopters is probably one of the most safe means of transportation you have, if you take out air medical, etc., etc. So the business itself, the helicopter society also is in fault somehow, because the data is not collected. We are not very good at promoting all the good things in this, except for medical. Everybody likes the medical helicopters.
Dave, we're wrapping up in a few minutes. I want to know, I mean, we've been talking about perception that only wealthy people really are using business aviation, but actually if you look at any wealth reports, the number of wealthy has been increasing far beyond the growth level of our industry. So what are we missing? You know, what's the problem that we haven't talked about that is really holding the industry back?
Wow. That's a very good question.
You got to start with the original premise. You think the business is being held back.
Very good point. So Steve, your view is that, you know, we went through a boom phase, we're going through a quiet phase, but it's still growing. It's still a growth story.
From a corporate jet standpoint, you know, if you take 20 years, the average new aircraft sales have been 630, 640 new jets a year. That's exactly how many they're delivering this year. I mean, you know, sure, in 06, 07, 08, you saw, you know, peak was a perfect storm. But it's been 640 jets. Okay, they went from small to big. Now they're back to big again, or medium to big. But it's the same amount of airplanes being sold for 20 years. So it's not hurting. You know, the impression is bad. I mean, in the showroom that I have, I get a lot of non-aviation media coming in to do interviews. And the first question they always ask is, what's the craziest thing somebody's done with the interior of their airplane? Every single person asks the same question. And I give them the same answer. Sorry, I have a boring answer for you. Nothing. You know, the people don't do what you think they do in these things, you know. And I think NBA had a statistic that 70% of the passengers in corporate jets are middle management people. Or, you know, and those are the kind of things that need to be promoted. And we try to do that in the showroom when we do the interview. We try to educate these people to tell them the positives and keep not answering, you know, any negative pointed questions like politicians do. So.
We've got a couple of minutes before we start towards the next panel. What questions do we have? I've got some on my screen, but Terry, do you want to put
Terry Spruce. We, as an industry, seem to sell luxury, but Joe Public doesn't seem to believe that that is for them. Maybe we ought to look at doing pictures of hard-working business middle managers, not with champagne, but cups of coffee and sandwiches on the aeroplane.
The problem we face, though, is that nobody, if you look at America, it's an aspirational industry. Everybody wants a business jet. I mean, Trump has sort of helped it start again, but there was always that. I remember sitting at NBAA with two guys who run a company that builds roads. Now, I can't imagine sitting at the same dinner here and having a conversation with two guys who run a road laying company who thought about a business jet, scale of the country and everything, fine. But this, whenever it's the question we get asked when we have you know, people like yourselves coming to talk to us, can you put us in touch with someone who uses your services to talk about it? I can't. Nobody ever wants to talk about it. It's almost like this kind of dark hidden secret that nobody wants to admit has happened, and yet it's saving people time, and that time thing is so quantifiable. But people just have this natural aversion to sort of going, yeah, I use the business jet. Look at me. It just doesn't happen.
Watch this space. The opening video at eBay is just that. People who are using business aircraft. To me, one of the challenges, I think I know quite a lot of people that could use a business aircraft, but they don't even think about it. And the reason they don't think about it, it's very opaque. It's damn difficult to find one. It's a tortuous process. I mean, okay, we can go to a broker, but finding bids and all this sort of thing, we have to make it easier. And I think some of the new business models coming will make it easier. And I think the more we see, I mean, no one's going to pretend a PC-12 is luxurious. No one who's flown in a Hawker 800 with 8 or 9 people in it is going to pretend it's luxurious. But it does get you damn quickly from A to B. And even if you do have to step over each other's knees to move about and all this sort of thing, and the best you get is a plastic cup of coffee, you know, it's saving you time. So I think that what we have to recognize, there is a top end, and I know Murray likes to talk about it, wherever you are, Murray, there is a top end, and that's important in job creation and so on. But what we're seeing, or going to see in Europe over the next few years, is a big extension downwards. And I think that gives us a great opportunity to market business aviation as a real tool and not a luxury.
Some other questions? We've probably got a chance for one or two.
Yeah, Tim Robertson, Royal Aeronautical Society. I come with the building. The laptop bans that we've had from the Middle East, it's been in the news today about extending it to Europe, which is yeah, just really brilliant. You know, no laptops, no Kindles. It's not really a question of challenges, but do you see an impact on that in pushing more people, more business people towards private aviation, corporate aviation?
From a commercial perspective, it would be no different. We'd be subject to the same regulations for commercial flying. But
privately, you can do what you want.
I don't think you are.
No, I don't think we are, because you get access to the whole anyway.
10, and you know,
yeah.
you can carry a laptop in the airplane.
I mean, I think the thing about this is, as the airline experience gets worse and worse, and as the airport experience gets worse and worse, I mean, I was coming back from Brussels, SN Brussels, loved the airline, on Friday night, an hour and a half late. By the time I get back to Heathrow, the M25's closed, the M3's closed, and I get home at midnight when I should have got home at 8 o'clock. And you think, isn't this fun? Now, when we've got single engine turbine, we've got twin turboprops, affordable options, put a few people in them, And all these fares are going up and up. Anybody look at a BA fare to Brussels? You can easily pay £400 for return. It's starting to look more attractive. So I think the more we see of this bottom-end expansion, the better the market's going to be and the more success we'll have. Somebody's got his hand up over there.
Yeah, I think we've got to take this as a last question. You're calling time. So please, go ahead.
We're talking about here a lot about efficiency, and we're going to talk about lower price point. But if you look at how business aviation started, in every magazine, all the webs, everything is just pure luxury too.
You're right.
If you're going to reach that lower price point, bigger user base, the whole marketing concept needs to change.
You need to move to an industrial part, Steve. Move the showroom.
Yeah.
That'd save me rent.
Do a model of an Eclipse instead of a BBJ.
I want to go back to what you were asking before about all these miserable airline experiences. I think that's going to drastically help, you know, these Jet Smarters, the Surf Airs, and you know, Fly Victor and these guys. I think it is going to bring people in, at least those that can afford it. But that is becoming an affordable option to fly private, and eventually that just gives a better opinion of what the industry is contributing, and it'll hopefully will have some wave of positive influence over the rest of the community.
It's been a very good session, and we're unfortunately going to have to close it. We could go on for ages. So I really want to thank you and thank my panel in particular.